during COVID-19. This session today is on MTSS. It is not on skills and strategies, as it says in front of you right now. And you are in the right place if you're looking for MTSS. I just didn't change the slide. So things are kind of last minute these days, and that's where I'm at. So one note for this session is that we're going to ask that everyone remain muted for the entirety, and that is so that we can record it. And then if you don't mind, if you have questions, I'd love to discuss them at the end. You can just jot them down or type them, I guess, and we can hold on to them. And I'm happy to talk at the end as we pretty much take the first 45 minutes or an hour, which will be kind of just direct from me. So at this time, I'm going to ask my colleague Louise Dutra to begin the recording, and we will get started here. So again, I mentioned my name is Andrew Ecker. I want to also acknowledge my other colleagues from the Guidance and Child Study Center who are on with us right now. Dr. Desalia Lopez, bilingual school psychologist and evaluation specialist, and Louise Dutra, secretary to school administrator. And I want to thank them for all their support, both putting together this webinar series as well as for all they're doing for our schools. So thank you both. Guidance and Child Study Center exists to improve school and life outcomes for kids who are the most vulnerable and kids who are marginalized. And if you think about the trauma response, kids who have experienced trauma are certainly some of our most vulnerable students. And we know that being marginalized by our schools, by our society, by our medical system, these things can inflict trauma upon kids. So that's why we're here. I appreciate so much that you're here, and I hope that this can help support you and your work during this time. Our agenda for today, we're going to start off with a brief opening, a couple acknowledgements, and we're going to take a few moments for self-care for ourselves. We are then going to get into MTSS and trauma response, and it's going to be sort of a, hopefully, a sort of braiding of back and forth between the systems pieces of MTSS and the specific content related to trauma responsive schools. I included these first three non-bolded items just to show kind of where we've been through our first two meetings of Trauma 101, as well as skills and strategies. So in these first two sessions, we've learned about different types of traumatic experiences as well as their prevalence. We've discussed how exposure to trauma can impact emotional, social, and academic functioning. I hope that we've enhanced our ability to support students who have been exposed to trauma. That was part two. That's really the skills and strategies. And then today is a much broader lens. It's really about, so how do we take whatever it is that we're doing in terms of our trauma responsive skills and strategies and align these within our existing systems, of multi-tier systems of support going forward. And that's kind of where we are today with a much broader lens. Again, at the end, I'm happy to stick around and we can take questions, talk. I apologize for asking you to remain muted until then. At this presentation and all of its resources, as well as the video, will be posted to YouTube. And if you'd like to receive this presentation, please just enter your email into the chat box, and Louise Dutra will send this to you at its conclusion. Her email is posted here, but you don't need to send her an email. You can just put your email into the chat box. So I mentioned that this is part three, and I want to thank you if you were able to join for Trauma 101, part one, and Skills and Strategies, part two. As you can see in the top left, this is part three, Trauma and MTSS. Next week, we're going to shift, and this series is going to be Enhancing Trauma Responsive Schools for School Leaders. And this is going to shift the focus to include supporting our staff and our communities and the experience with trauma and the impact of that for adults. So up to this point, this series is meant for all educators, for anyone who works in the school to learn more about trauma and effective skills and strategies. This next piece is really the lens of leadership, and not just supporting kids, but supporting our staff, our colleagues, families, and what are some things that we should be thinking about right now while we are working remotely and virtually, and then how to maybe prepare for reentry. I mentioned Dr. Desalia Lopez, who is joining us today. She facilitates our school clinicians forum. So on the right side of your screen now, you see the dates for those meetings, and our virtual end of year celebration is actually coming up on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. So we hope that you can join for that. And we're here to support our clinical staff, our educators, school leaders, anyone around school mental health, because we all have mental health. School is the place where we get to support kids. So we know how critical it is that we are supporting kids' mental health and social emotional wellness in everything that we do. So this series started last week, and I want to just give a big thank you for Teacher Appreciation Week, which we're going to say continues now and maybe every week going forward. And I just want to thank all of our teachers for everything that you're doing during this time and supporting our kids in the virtual classroom in their homes. It's just such incredible work. I'm so appreciative and such gratitude for all that you're doing. So I want to thank you so much for that. I also want to give special acknowledgement to so many different organizations that are supporting our work during this time across New York State as well as across the country. I'm able to share these resources today because of public funding and grant funding through organizations like the National Center for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, as well as so much of the work that SAMHSA has put out there around trauma response, our technology transfer centers, and the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center. And I really apologize if I have not included anyone in this. I want to be able to share these resources and give attribution as appropriate. So just want to thank so many organizations who are supporting us during this crisis. I also want to acknowledge that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we are proud to partner with the Mental Health Association in New York State to talk about mental health awareness, to eliminate the stigma around mental health. We all have mental health just as we all have physical health. And we want to be able to acknowledge that, to talk about it in the same way, to identify our strengths, to identify our challenges with mental health, and know that that's a huge step towards getting treatment, towards supporting ourselves, towards living a healthy life. So I want to thank you all for being a part of this and for all that you are doing to bring mental health to the forefront and to improve mental health of our kids and everyone. So I mentioned we're going to start with self-care, and I think this is really important that we focus on this. I know I've had to be really intentional about my own self-care, even just through my experience in preparing materials for these workshops, really being embedded in this work. So I can imagine that for all of you who are supporting kids and supporting others, and for the trauma that we've experienced ourselves, self-care is just so critical at this time, because we know that we need to be well in order to support others. So if we think about this like being on the airplane, we need to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before putting it on the child next to us. So if we think about self-care, we've been using this ABCs of wellness around awareness, balance, connection. And I hope that we can take a moment to think about these things now, and maybe when this webinar is over today, you can devote some time to your own self-care. When we talk about awareness, we mean awareness of our emotions. So how are we feeling right now? And just being aware of that, being aware of, am I stressed? Am I happy? Am I experiencing anxiety or anything like that? And giving ourselves the permission to think about how we're feeling, to acknowledge how we are feeling, and the permission to also say that I'm not feeling good right now. You know, that something isn't right, or that I'm stressed out, or I'm unhappy, or my kids are driving me crazy. Like, we just need to give ourselves the permission to feel this way, to express them, and that's a huge critical part of self-care, starting with our awareness of how we are. B is for balance. So the balance of all these different things that we have happening right now, which for most of us are probably all happening in the same place. So how do we ensure balance of our family obligations, of our personal obligations, and our own self-care, of if we're educators and teaching kids and all these things that we have. So one thing that is consistent through self-care, as well as the trauma responsive schools and other things, are keeping routines of setting up schedules so we can have consistency, so we can schedule time for ourselves, if it's physical care, if it's meditation, if it's taking a break, mindfulness, whatever it is, that we have the balance necessary so that we can do well. And the last one, C, is for connection. So how can we maintain and promote connections that we have with our loved ones, with family, with friends, with colleagues? During this time, we're probably experiencing some disconnection from people that we would have seen or might be easier to see. So we want to be intentional about maintaining the strong connections. I think this connects strongly to balance and having times, whether they're set aside for family or other ways, but maintaining connections, even the opportunity to vent with colleagues is connecting about all the things that you're experiencing right now. So if you can focus on one of those things, something in awareness, something in balance, something in connection. We can't do it all, nor should we, but just try to find one thing, try to find some time. We owe it to ourselves, and I hope that it goes a long way towards your well-being. Part of self-care is hydration, so that's an opportunity within my presentation to remind me to drink water. And I've also borrowed some tips that I've interpreted as self-care from Governor Cuomo. So I'm going to share a couple of these anecdotes that I've picked up from his press conferences. The first one I noticed the first time was actually the day when he announced a couple weeks ago that schools would be closed for the rest of the year. So I think we are about 6 weeks in with about 6 weeks to go until the end of the typical school year. And he said, remember where we are and what we've accomplished. And this is something that I've really held on to and kind of think about every day, in that there's so much uncertainty. There's a lot of work that we have to do. There's a lot that we can't control, but we can acknowledge what we have accomplished. And we've done some really great things. So I hope that you can acknowledge that in yourself, acknowledge something every day. Waking up in the morning is an accomplishment, putting one foot in front of the other, and find these things and acknowledge yourself. Give yourself kind of a pat on the back for what we've accomplished and where we were and how far we've come. The second one here is that it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not have the answers. And it's okay to express that. And I think that vulnerability is, that way is really a sign of strength. It also shows how we might not know individually, but I know that as a group and as a network that we will figure out the answers together. The third one is to wear a mask. This is literal in that if you are outside, you cannot social distance. It's really important to wear a mask. But it also shows that we care for other people. It shows that we care for people who are more vulnerable, for older people in our community, for people who might be sick. So it's not only protecting ourselves, but it's a sign to others that we care for them. And I think that connects to the last one, which is love, which is, again, there's so much that we can't control. There's so much scary stuff happening. But I think that if we love ourselves, if we love each other, if we lead with compassion, I think that that's a big step towards self-care for ourselves and for care for each other. Also want to share resources that are available for anyone who is struggling or in a crisis. The New York State Office of Mental Health has an emotional support helpline that is free and confidential and available in multiple languages for any callers experiencing increased anxiety due to coronavirus. It is always okay to call. Nothing is ever too small, and you can share this information with others. There's help, there's people there, and we're always here. So on the bottom, you will see the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is available both in English and Spanish. Again, if you are in a crisis, if you know anyone who is suicidal or is having expressing thoughts or you think thoughts of hurting themselves, always make the call. There's always someone there. There's also opportunities for texting and for chatting through their website if you don't feel comfortable speaking on the phone. So we want to share these. We also want to be intentional. I mentioned, Mental Health Awareness Month and destigmatizing discussions of mental health. So this isn't just for ourselves, but I also want us to be intentional about making public statements about mental health challenges, about crises. If we were in a building and we were in a room, there would be fire emergency guidelines. You would know what to do in an emergency. There's first aid kits. These are all things that we do in a crisis for physical things. we should definitely know what to do in a crisis for mental health as well. So this is here as resources for us, for anyone, and I encourage you to share these widely and to make them public as we go forward. Okay, so we are going to have a really brief review of some of the main tenets of trauma and trauma responsive schools, and then we will get into both MTSS and aligning these practices within them. So we've used this definition from SAMHSA of childhood trauma, which is that trauma arises from an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms an individual's coping mechanisms. And an individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So there's a lot here. This definition has existed for many years. What we've discussed in our first two series is that we know the definitions of trauma, we know the definitions of adverse childhood experiences. What we are doing right now, and we're learning on the fly together, is we are generalizing these things for our current context. We are generalizing these for, how many of our kids have been impacted directly by trauma. I would say all of them. How many of our teachers, how many of our staff, how many of ourselves? We have experienced this. We are in it right now. And what we don't know is how long these adverse effects will have, because we don't know what the future might hold for those, but we do know from past studies that these things can happen longitudinally. They manifest in very different ways. And what we can do as educators and as schools is best prepare ourselves to create safe, supportive environments for kids now and as we return to school or whatever format it is going forward. So in our first two meetings with Trauma 101 and Skills and Strategies, we talked about the 4 R's of a trauma responsive school system. The first being to realize the prevalence and impact of trauma. The second, to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. The third, to respond by integrating trauma-informed principles to create a safe and nurturing school climate. And the last one, resist re-traumatization. And this is what gets us to today, where we know what's been happening already in schools. And I would say that that's our baseline phase here. So we know that already in schools, things that exist, some of the maladies, there's achievement and opportunity gaps. We had discipline practices, reactive discipline practices that have, traumatized kids. We have discrimination, there's bullying, harassment, violence. It include non-scientific decision-making in schools, classroom climate, mental illness. These are all some of the things that kids have experienced in schools that can be traumatizing. And what we're knowing, what we know about this context now is that during COVID-19, there are new challenges that we are experiencing. Some of them have been around in other ways. Some of them are sharply rising right now, but some of the challenges could be things like unemployment, homelessness. First, the impacts of COVID-19 around illness, death, disruption and trauma, but hunger and poverty, mental and physical illness, discrimination, harassment. There's a sharp increase in domestic violence, child abuse. We know that there's family disruption and change and achievement loss in school. So this is what we know about trauma. This is what we know is happening right now. And we need to think about, I don't know if new normal is the right term, whatever it is, but we need to have some sort of this recalibration, some sort of renovation for schools so that we can support kids with education, with people with employment, and all the other structures that go into this. So what we are looking at and what we're talking about is finding the existing things that already work, enhancing them, promoting them at this time so that we can really get the most out of them and best help kids. We can't do everything. So we need to know what's working so that we can do them and really enhance them going forward. And we've started each of our first two meetings with this diagram of the brain just so we can really visualize what is happening to kids when they've experienced acute trauma, and then some of the long-term chronic stress effects. So the amygdala, which is the little green part in the center of this diagram here, is the part of the brain that controls our fight or flight reactions to things. So when there's an event, when there's something scary that happens, a traumatic experience, our amygdala is firing, which is really good. It gets us out of burning buildings without having to think about it. It gets us out of unsafe situations and scary things really fast. We also know that the amygdala, when it is firing, it's working so much that the other parts of our brain are shutting down. So the prefrontal cortex, which controls our thinking, logic, what to do, evaluation of situations, that part is not functioning as strongly. The hippocampus, which regulates emotions and memory, that part is not functioning at that time. So when our amygdala is firing during an emergency, that's good. When it's working so hard, if we think about it like exercise and like a muscle, that amygdala has worked out so well, unfortunately, that it's too strong and the other parts of our brain are not strong enough. So what we need to do is to support kids in ways where the hippocampus, where the prefrontal cortex, where all that emotional regulation and learning and the cognitive pieces come in, where we can get those parts of the brain going again. And we follow this sort of logic line, which is that when kids have exposure to trauma, when they have the adverse childhood experiences, we know that this leads to proximal outcomes in the immediate of poor academic outcomes, of emotional difficulties and social impairments, and the long-term problems, which is really great in that there's chronic health problems, lower employment, higher rates of incarceration, and mental illness as well. I also want to acknowledge that it's not just about the adverse childhood experiences that are happening or that students experience directly. There's also adverse community environments. So things like poverty, discrimination, community disruption. When we think about our kids who have experienced any of these things like mental illness, incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence, we also need to think about our communities and our environments as well. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Cecilia Lopez, who this is her background and her expertise. So I look forward to much more work together and supporting our schools, especially in these areas. So what we can do, and this is what we're here for, is to say, so we know that there are adverse childhood experiences. We know that our students are experiencing trauma. What can we do? And that's the TRS, that's the trauma responsive schools. Because we know that when we implement trauma responsive schools, we can change things. And we have the power to have that impact with kids where we have improved academic achievement, improved social emotional wellness, and long-term, this leads to better health outcomes, stable employment, and lower incarceration rates. So the last part of, I guess I would say the review portion before we get into MTSS, that we want to ground everything in our guiding principles of trauma-informed care. And we're going to revisit these 6 guiding principles when we talk about teams, because teams are such a critical part of this work. But we know that our guiding principles start in cultural humility, in valuing equity and cultural responsive practices, that we value empowerment, voice and choice, mutuality, we support collaboration, trust and transparency, peer collaboration, and safety, both physical safety, psychological safety for our kids, and not just for kids, but for ourselves as well. And again, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about teaming, but this needs to be true for adults before we can have the impact with kids. And one shift that you can make for a trauma responsive lens is when we shift our perspective. And that's one from saying what's wrong with that student to what has happened with that student. It's a big shift, but it shifts from a deficit mindset that there's something wrong with them to they have experiences. And we need to know that kid in order to teach that kid. We need to know what their story is. We need to know what they value. We need to know what their family experience is so that we can help them. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about risk enhancers and then protective factors. And we've talked about these protective factors in our skills and strategies, but we know that there are things that help kids. So in terms of supporting themselves when they've experienced trauma. One of those is self-management skills. Obviously, we want kids to be able to manage for themselves their emotions. We want them to be able to self-manage their academics, their life. We want them to be independent. So self-management skills are a protective factor when we talk about trauma. Other protective factors are interpersonal skills, healthy habits, and academic competence. On the other side of that, we know that the things that enhance risk, trauma itself, negative modeling, family, school, community disruption, and also discrimination. Those are things that enhance risk with kids. So on the left-hand side are ineffective responses. We talked about some of those, so I'm not going to go into them here. We don't need to see the non-examples. Let's focus on the right-hand side and the effective responses here. So we want to start with trauma-informed decision-making so that we can look across our schools, across our districts, and identify students, know who needs what, and know who has experienced what type of trauma. We want to focus on prevention-based behavioral sciences. And that's really the key to MTSS when we look at this is, what are we doing for all students? What are we doing for a few students? And what are we doing for individual students? So we always want to focus on this prevention-based behavioral sciences. This is actually a medical model. It's a public health model. It's what we're doing right now, which is that we want to support all people, public health, and then we will address individuals. That's the tiered system. We always want to use data to inform any of our decisions. When we have professional development, we want it to be continuous. We know that the one and done doesn't work. We can't just hope that this sticks and that people get it. So we need to have continuous coaching available. We need to focus on the fidelity of implementation, which is so critical because we can't get the outcomes that we want if we don't implement things the way they were intended to be implemented. And lastly, we need proactive, competent, and informed leadership. So some good news is that schools are really good at some of the things that are most important for supporting kids who have experienced trauma. Because when we think about it, schools are one of our most structured, predictable, continuous social support systems. So we talked about generalizing things. We need to take all the positive things that we do in schools every day and now think about how can we generalize these things? How can we replicate them in ways that work remotely, in ways that work through new technology, or however it is that we are reaching kids. But let's approach this from a premise that schools do a really awesome job for the vast majority of our kids in creating structured, predictable, continuous social support systems. And we have so much time with kids during the year. We do a great job getting to know them, of knowing what their interests are, what their goals are, what their challenges are, so that we can support them. So let's lean on and privilege all the great work that we've done and not throw any of that out before we think about how to change things going forward. I apologize for the wordiness of this slide. This is, again, just some last minute things here, but if you can bear with me, we're going to talk through sort of the definition of MTSS. And again, we're going to be going back and forth between the MTSS specific piece and trauma responsive piece. So MTSS is the multi-tier system of support. Our goal here is to improve student outcomes across school domains. So our academic support, our behavioral, our social, emotional wellness. This is one system, one framework for supporting these things. And it's designed to enhance the effectiveness of our work, the efficiency, meaning like the doability, like I can actually do this, and the relevance. So we want things that are really specific to our students' need, to their outcomes, and to our cultures. And as I mentioned, the main mechanism for operationalizing this is through the establishment of decision-making leadership teams. So we're going to spend some time today talking about teams. And next week with our school leaders series, there will also be a great deal of information in there on teams as well, also based on the information that we are talking about today. So we start with always the student outcomes, always saying that this is what we value, this is what we want kids to know, be able to do for their lives, because that's our purpose, that's why we're here. And working backwards from our student outcomes, we know that data drive our decisions, and that from that we choose the practices and the systems so that we can achieve our outcomes. When we think about our team, we need representation from those who are the stakeholders. So it's not just top down, but we need to have teachers, classified staff, administration, families, students, specialized supports. And we'll look further at what that looks like in a real trauma responsive system. We need support and we need authorization by school and district administrators to make implementation school-wide decisions. We're recognizing that this is a big system. This is not something that people can do on their own or in their own classroom. And that this is also going to take time, that these are long-term plans. Typically we think about 3 to 5 year implementation action plans for establishing and maintaining continuums of academic and social behavioral supports. So for MTSS principles, first one is that MTSS is for all students and all family and all school members. If you think about MTSS as a combination of response to intervention and the RTI academic side of things and positive behavioral intervention and supports and PBIS, just like that, just like PBIS is for all students and RTI is for all students, MTSS is for all students. It is a framework for how we do our work. And it starts with knowing and really valuing that MTSS is for all students and all family and all school members. Additionally, we need to start from a socially and educationally important student outcomes. So that drives our work. Do we value this? Otherwise, what's the point? So we need, those are the ultimate criteria for all decisions related to funding, practice selection, meaning like what program are we going to do, and implementation, as well as policy, professional development, everything. Everything that we do runs through this check of, is this getting us the student outcomes that we want? And assuming first that these are important student outcomes to our kids, to their families, to our community, and to ourselves. When we identify practices that we want to implement or programs that we want to implement, let's see these as investments. These are investments in kids' lives, and we don't take this lightly. So we need to start from a place where we are only investing in practices where we have empirically valid or empirically based evidence so that research supports this, and not just research for all. This is where the research needs to be really specific, because we need to know what works for whom and under what conditions. We can't just say that we read one study and this worked for this one population. We need to know specifically what works for whom and under what conditions. We also need to know that this will work in our context. And that's a huge part, because we need to have the resources, we need to know that we can do this. And as we think about working remotely, this may be, we might have been planning to implement something next year, but if we don't know that we can do this virtually and we can't do it well, and we know that our staff are burned out and it's like we can't do one more thing, then maybe this might not be the right time to try that. We need to know that we can develop high fidelity implementation and that it's durable. So the high fidelity piece, again, when we talk about discrete practices, especially in mental health, there are very specific steps to implementing these practices. And without the expectation that we can actually do those steps, we can't expect to get the desired outcomes. So we need to have high fidelity, at the same time, durable implementation, meaning that we are okay knowing that there might be an implementation dip. So anytime that we learn something new, performance as a practitioner can actually decrease, which can actually cause student outcomes to decrease in the short term. So we need to know about implementation science, we need to know what implementation looks like. And remember, we're talking about 3 to 5 years on large-scale programs, and look at just what's happened in the last 6 weeks. So this is what I'm saying about taking the research, what we know is out there, but for this context right now, we don't have 3 to 5 years. So we need to go off of what is already working, what exists for us, what works for us virtually, and how can we embed these effective strategies into what is already working for us right now. Continuing on, we need strong participation. So we typically think, just like kids, we want to get about 80 to 90% of people on board with this. That includes administrators. We need engagement, participation. People need to be able to lead by example, and they need to be able to see others modeling this. They need to also know that it's okay when we're trying to implement something, that it's going to be difficult at first, and that it's okay to fail. We need to be safe taking risks, and we need to have data on all of this so that we can continuously analyze it, because we need to always know, are students responding to the practice and progress toward desired outcomes? Think about this. If we say we want to do something for kids and we've identified a problem, but we don't know what the benchmarks are along the way, then how will we ever know if we got there? If we get there and we achieved it, we won't know, and we won't be able to say, great, that worked. And worse, if things are not improving, then how will we ever know when to discontinue doing what it is we set out to do? So fortunately, there are some supports that are available so we can maintain implementation fidelity. I've included them linked at the bottom, so you can see them. The first is the District System Fidelity Inventory, which is a district-wide lens for implementation fidelity, and the one below it is the school-wide tiered fidelity inventory, as well as the reading tiered fidelity inventory. These are resources that you as a school team or as a district team can assess MTSS implementation across various tiers. So here's our beloved triangle, our pyramid continuum that we live by, which is that we look at the continuum. This is blended because things are fluid, but these are interventions. These are supports that we put in place for kids. And just as a little sneak peek to next week, when we talk about school leaders, we are talking about supports that we put in place for staff and for our community. But for right now, we're going to be focusing on kids and the supports that we put in place to meet kids' needs at all different levels. So some important things here. The first, as I mentioned, MTSS is this uniting of what we typically call the academic side, or like response to intervention, and the social emotional behavioral side, or PABIS. What we also know is that tiers refer to interventions and never to students. I think that's really critical. Tiers refer to interventions and never to students, because kids are dynamic. Every person is dynamic. So the tiers refer to interventions. It's what we as adults do to meet kids' needs. I'm gonna skip ahead 1 second just to kind of show what I mean by this, which is that there are no tier 3 kids or tier 1 kids. That doesn't exist. Tiers are interventions because kids are dynamic and we do well at certain things. We might have challenges in other areas. And this is just one example, sort of a profile for a student and the different skills that they have. So we can start here and say that this student is very social. So you can see that when it comes to skills for developing and keeping friendships, they're doing great. The universal support that is in place to teach kids about friendship and about safe friendships, they're doing great with. Sometimes they struggle with anxiety. So, we have a targeted support that is available for this student, maybe in a small group with a couple other students who work on skills to help them when they are anxious. Sometimes the student becomes really anxious and they might have suicidal ideations. For this, we absolutely know that this requires an intensive intervention, probably with community mental health, family supports as well. So that's an intensive, top of the line intervention in terms of tier, where it's individualized for that one student. The student also really struggles with reading. So they need, in addition to the universal curriculum and the other supports that they have, they need an individualized reading intervention. And you can see how, go through the other examples, but the point being is that this kids as well as adults, we are dynamic, and that the tiers refer to interventions. And it's really important for us to think about that, because we can receive a tier 3 intervention in one area and not need it in the other. Also knowing that these things aren't life sentences. It is not meant to mean that if I am receiving an intensive individualized reading intervention, that I'm always going to need it. We would certainly hope that if you are experiencing suicidal ideations and need an intensive intervention, that it's not going to be permanent. So it also shows that these things fluctuate and speaks to how important it is that we have data to support the decisions that we make. Because what we would certainly hope is that after receiving intensive intervention and improving social skills and anxiety and these things, that the suicidal ideations would then decrease, therefore meaning I no longer need this intensive intervention in this area. I would hope that I also improve my reading, and maybe I don't need this intensive intervention in a reading area. If we think of kids as tier 3 kids, then we're always going to think that they always need that tier 3 intervention. But tiers refer to interventions, not to students, and the interventions are what we do. So I mentioned that we're going to revisit the team action plan suggestions and how important the teams are. And these are some of the action plans for MTSS teams. So we want to work as a team, certainly with common vision, values, languages, and routines. We mentioned using data. And what are the different types of data that we want to look at? Well, we want to look at risk screeners, student outcome progress data, and then implementation fidelity data to guide any of our decision making going forward. We also mentioned considering all students. Remember, thinking back to the tier size of what all students need, what some students need, and what few students need. I think this fourth one is so important for right now, which is that we want to commit to a small number of measurable, achievable, observable student outcomes for each group. This is hard in a typical school setting. I think it's even harder right now. We need to really prioritize what are the small number of things that we want to know about our students, that we want to know how they're doing, and that we can identify those things and collect data and check in on them going forward. That way, once we have a small number of measurable, achievable, observable student outcomes, then we can prioritize and select a small number of practices that are evidenced and validated that they align to our systems outcomes. And what I'm going to do now is backtrack, because we talked a bit about MTSS. We're now going to align this with the trauma responsive pieces. So we started with our MTSS and our multi-tiers. And what I like about this is that it looks at trauma responsive practices and policies also in a tiered format. And if anyone would like to create a PowerPoint slide of merging these two things, I would be very grateful. But let's look at the same idea, the same logic behind here, what we do for all students in tier 1, what we do for some students as a targeted intervention in tier 2, and what we do as an intensive individualized intervention in tier 3. Here's our trauma responsive practices and policies. So we start with community and family supports for everyone. That is universal. It is for our entire community, for all families, and of course for all students. We then know that layered on top of that, we have whole school safety prevention planning and staff support. We know that we have whole school trauma programming and support, so really specific to individualized schools, also recognizing that some schools, even within the same district, have different needs. Layering on top of that, similarly, as we drill down, we know that classrooms have specific needs and that there are specific practices that teachers can implement to support kids in the classroom. And then specifically early interventions for trauma for kids and targeted interventions for kids. Now, for each of these in sort of the concentric circles here, there are some notes that are included in this PowerPoint at the end that give more specific examples of what these are. I'm not including them here just for time, so we're going to kind of jump back into the MTSS piece, but I want you to know that these are defined in greater detail so you can see some examples of what these are. Okay, so we're jumping back over to our trauma responsive MTSS team. And remember, these are our trauma responsive principles, and now we're sort of breaking them out to see, so what would this actually look like for a trauma responsive MTSS team? I'm going to start at the bottom of the screen with our foundation here. around cultural humility and equity. So we believe, and we need to value that in a trauma-responsive MTSS team, that the team reflects the ethnic and racial diversity of the school and community population. When we talk about empowerment, voice, and choice, our team should include the marginalized voices on campus. And obviously we can think about the implications of if we want to include marginalized voices on campus, then what work do we need to do so that we know who the voices are that are marginalized by us? For collaboration and mutuality, we know that teams should be multidisciplinary, including all disciplines and all levels of staff, and that we really need to have honest leveling of power and shared decision-making. In terms of peer support, we need to presume the best intentions, that staff assume that all members' intentions are positive and that all members recognize each other's strengths, interests, and contributions. Trust and transparency, we want operations and decisions to be made in a clear and transparent manner, and we want to create predictability and consistency. And in terms of safety, we want team operations to be conducted in a manner that fosters psychological, sorry for the typo, psychological safety of all participants. So again, what we've done here is we've taken the 6 trauma-responsive principles, and we've taken the principles of what makes a successful MTSS team, and we've brought those 2 things together. So if we want to have trauma-responsive practices that improve outcomes for kids, it starts with us, and we need to do that work as teams so that we can have strong systems that support the critical skills and strategies that we use for kids. I'm going to skip over this one for right now, but I would just say this is another diagram that shows the implementation drivers and capacity for teams. And the most important point I would say is that on the top in the pink, we see the things that we need sort of outside of the school for things to happen. So we need stakeholder support, funding, we need systems to be aligned, we need the workforce capacity. All those things support our MTSS team. And then from our team, we need to ensure that there's training, coaching, evaluation, and performance feedback, and that we actually have the expertise in the practices that we're talking about in order to get the outcomes that we want. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's going to be happening going forward. Oops, sorry. All right, so we're going to talk about schedule, who we're going to target, and at what tiers. So these are some examples of when we would want to be really specific in our schedule about connecting with students, with families, with our colleagues. And we know that before and after transitions, things in the school year, other events, we want to really increase engagement around these times. We also want to adjust our engagement by the tier, and we want to consider our implementation phase. And I'll show what I mean by that in just a second. So when we talk about targeting, we want to think about students, families, and educators. So in a trauma-responsive school, I mentioned we're starting with the kids and what those effective practices are, but in order for the whole system to be responsive, we need to take a step back and talk about our families as well as our educators. So for students who want to display expected behaviors, who want to live and really model the things that we want them to do, same thing for families as well as for educators. And that's why I think that it was important personally to have a piece specific for school leaders, because we need to acknowledge the trauma that our school systems have experienced during this time. And if we can, if we can identify who we're targeting, so our students, we're talking about families, we're talking about teachers and staff, then we can differentiate the trauma-responsive practices that are needed. We can differentiate how much teaching we're doing around something. We can look at different data for different groups. So here's an MTSS planning matrix. We can start to identify some of the things that we are already doing, what it looks like, who it's for, and when are we going to schedule these things going forward. And what I would do is just start with this first row of what are we doing now? Let's just identify all the different things that we're doing as a system to support students. What are all the things we're doing right now to support all families? And what are all the things we're doing right now to support educators? That's the universal all. On the right-hand side, we would say, okay, for students who are struggling right now, what are some of the things that we are doing? What are the things that we are doing for some of the students who are struggling? What things are in place for some of the families who are struggling and some of the educators? And then finally, when we know that there's an individual student with a really intense need, when we know that there's a family in our community who's really struggling, or an educator who is really struggling, what are those intensive interventions that are in place right now? I think it's so critical and also so helpful for us to give ourselves the permission to take the time to sort of complete this audit of sorts, to say, look at all that we're doing. You know, we are doing so much. Let's organize these things. Let's see how efficacious they are. Because if it turns out that we're spending a lot of time on something that we're doing with all the families in our community, but it's not helping, then maybe we can stop doing it. We can take that off of our plate. And that's part of the permission that we need. We need the data to support that it's okay to stop doing something. You know, we can de-implement, we can take something off of our plate. We also know through implementation science that if we are going to implement something, that takes so much intentional attention that we need to actually stop implementing two things. And something I've been thinking about lately is that's a rule, again, when everything is typical in school. So when we were in school, we know that if we're going to implement a new program and we want it to go well, we need to take two things off of our plate. I would sort of venture that right now, if we want to implement something new, we need to take maybe 3 or 4 things off our plate, because it's so hard to work remotely. It's so hard to meet in these virtual formats. We don't all have access to technology. We're doing other things in our homes. There's so many other responsibilities, not to mention just the challenges of COVID-19. So if we're going to have the expectation that we are implementing something new, what 3, 4, 5 things are we going to stop doing? Because I think it's actually harmful to kids to think that we can keep adding things to our plate without taking anything off. And I mean harmful in that we have the best intentions, but they're the ones who are going to suffer if implementation diffs across all these multiple areas. So I know we're getting short on time, but I think this is an important slide here on implementation phases. And what I want to do is share sort of what things look like over time and on a typical setting, and then for ourselves and for our teams, we can figure out what that looks like right now. So typically, the different stages of implementation start from exploration, then installation, then initial implementation, then full implementation, and then finally sustained implementation and scaling up. But what we need to look at is, you know, what are the critical factors in each of these phases that we need to do before we implement any of our trauma responsive practices. Again, if we dedicate the time and attention to implement something, we want it to work. We deserve it, the kids certainly deserve it. So we need to be sure that we, if we're looking at any programs or practices, that we have a search team, that we've defined and measured the need and solution, that it's an evidence-based practice, that that it's going to get the priority that it needs. And all this work typically happens in at least a 3 to 6 month period, and oftentimes longer. Sometimes, you know, school districts look at different programs for a year, two or three years to evaluate the program to think it's the right one. We are making decisions so quickly right now that I don't think we even know if it's right or wrong. It's just the fact that we have to do it. So we want to make sure that even though these timelines might be changing, that we're still taking the steps and not skipping them as we expect to implement something going forward. And here's some simpler language, which is that in the exploration stage, we're saying, why are we doing this? You know, what is the purpose? What's the intended student outcome? And why are we selecting this practice to implement? During the installation stage, we're getting ready for it. During the initial stage, we're trying it out. During full implementation, we're saying, yep, we're going for it. And then finally, when we're scaling up, we're saying we're going to spread it to other areas. This is a 3 to 4 year process that probably happened in 3 to 4 days this past March. So we're taking what we know to be sort of best practice, and thanks to the incredible work of educators and school leaders, we are doing these things under such crunch conditions. But what we want to try to do is say, okay, if there are these important factors and some of these non-negotiables that we can't go without, what are those things that we need to be sure we are doing? So I mentioned that I was including at the end of this some more details on each of the trauma responsive pieces. So I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but I want to show you that they're here. So there's community and family supports, whole school safety and prevention planning, whole school staff support, whole school trauma programming, classroom strategies, early interventions for trauma, and targeted interventions for trauma. And a quick review here as we wrap up. If we do one thing, if we have one trauma responsive thing that we can do today, is that we can shift our perspective from saying what's wrong with that student to what has happened to that student. Going back to our framework here, we know that there's kids, we know that our communities are being ravaged right now with adverse childhood experiences and trauma, but we have great capability as educators and as schools to implement trauma responsive practices so that we can change the outcomes and change the lives of kids. And that's why we're here, to improve the academic outcome, improve kids' social emotional wellness, so that long term we have better life outcomes for our kids. Always close with revisiting our self-care. I want to thank you so much for being here, for all that you are doing, and I hope that you can take some time to check in with yourself for your own awareness, to ensure the balance of all that you're doing and connections with loved ones and with friends. Additionally, if you or anyone that you know is struggling, we have the New York State Office of Mental Health Emotional Support Line, as well as the National Suicide Prevention Lifelines available in English and Spanish, as well as other languages. And here's our upcoming schedule. We just completed part 3, trauma and MTSS. Next week, we will have part 1 and 2 of our Enhancing Trauma Responsive Schools for school leaders. This is for anyone at the building and district level, as well as others who have a district or school-wide lens on trauma responsive schools and supporting SEL and mental health with kids. And additionally, on the right-hand side, you can see our school clinicians forums that are coming up, as well as Monday's school clinicians forum and virtual end-of-year celebration. Lastly, I just want to remind you that if you would like to receive this PowerPoint and the resources in here today, you can just put your email in the chat, and Louise Dutra will get these to you. We're also recording all of these, so we can add you to our mailing list and get you upcoming information on school mental health tips, as well as other trainings. And lastly, I just want to thank you and wish you all the best. And what we're going to do is we're going to stop recording. If you have to take off, thank you for being here. If you'd like to stick around and talk, we're happy to. So we can I think everyone will probably be unmuted, or you can unmute